Well everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus and see how this phone holds up in 2023. Now, the one thing I will definitely tell you about this specific phone is that there is still so much power and so much capability behind the Galaxy S10 Plus that it's not even really fair. Like, this is still a very good phone. Unfortunately, with some of the things that have been changing a little bit with this device, it may not necessarily be the first phone I would recommend buying anymore, but this was a very good phone when it first came out. We never really saw a phone like this, I would say, from Samsung before. Like, I understand they had the Plus lineup and everything before, but the S10 series in general was just one of the craziest phones I've ever seen them make. Now, if you want to pick up this phone or maybe some other phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, the front of the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus had that 6.4-inch dynamic AMOLED display. It was a 1440p panel, 60Hz display, but the one thing I will definitely tell you, coming from the S9 Plus and S10 Plus, the panel of this thing looked so good. It had a little bit of bezel at the top and a little bit of bezel at the bottom, but this was still one of the better looking panels of that year. And also, it was probably still a really good looking panel. You had that dual camera hole punch display at the top right, which was a very interesting move from, Samsung. They've since never really brought back a dual camera setup on the front. So that's kind of an interesting thing that pretty much a lot of people may have forgotten about. But the front panel of this thing, I think, still looks very, very good for sure. Now, we did have that inbuilt fingerprint sensor in the display as well, which was really nice. And on the bottom of this phone, we had a couple of things that we normally don't have on a lot of phones nowadays. So we had the USB Type-C port, which is great, with Samsung DeX, which is even better. So that's another really cool thing that we had on this phone. We had a headphone jack 2 on this phone, which we pretty much don't have on any phones. But we also had that microSD card slot. Now, having that microSD card slot on this phone is amazing to have. And that is another really cool thing that we have on this specific phone that we pretty much didn't have on a lot of other phones. I mean, like, nowadays, that feature is pretty much already gone. But on top of that, even in 2019, a lot of phones during that moment didn't even have that microSD card slot, or they removed it. This specific phone had it, and that was another massive W in my opinion for the specific phone. Now, on the back, there was some other really cool, interesting stuff from Samsung that they brought here too. So for their base models, they brought a triple camera setup. So the S10 also had a triple camera setup, and this Plus lineup had that camera setup as well. And it was a very good camera. It was very solid for what it was. You had that entire glass back, which still looks very premium. You had reverse wireless charging, which is a brand new feature Samsung was putting on their phones. And things like that just made this phone feel like that absolute Plus lineup. This was the last phone in their Plus series when it was like the most expensive one. Since then, they have kind of switched over to their Ultra lineup, which is pretty much their like main, lineup, more expensive lineup as of this point. But when I look at the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus, and when I think back to 2019 and even 2020, when this phone was still like the number one phone, it was crazy to me how far ahead this phone seemed like the majority of other phones that were being sold at that moment. So in terms of that, I will definitely tell you the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus on the outside definitely gets a thumbs up for me for sure. Now, on top of that, the camera setup. This thing, like I said, had that triple camera setup on the back. It had a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, 12 megapixel telephoto lens, and then a 16 megapixel ultra wide camera. And on the front, it had that dual camera setup. So 10 megapixel wide and then an 8 megapixel wide angle lens as well. So the first thing I would definitely tell you is that in my opinion, having that type of camera setup is amazing. So it had 4K 60 on the front and 4K 60 on the back, which was really cool. And this phone, in my opinion, just kind of felt like the camera just could have held the test of time forever. So for one, it definitely wasn't like I would say it's not the best camera anymore, but during that year, I mean, it was really hard to kind of find things to kind of complain about with this camera. On top of that, this was the last phone that we had before the 8K capability came out on the S20. So we didn't really have like the missing of 8K because not really many phones had it. The features inside this camera too are still very solid. Like, you can do a lot of stuff within the updates that this phone has gotten with the camera. There's a lot of capability there from this camera by itself. So that is another big thing that I kind of have to think about. You would never think that this phone would still be handling or holding up fairly well in that specific camera department, but it is still doing its job, which is awesome. Now, maybe the only downside of this camera is probably with applications like Snapchat and TikTok and whatnot, but even then, like, you kind of expect, like, you kind of know that this camera is not going to be number one forever, especially with Androids and typically with those applications, but I think it's totally okay, and it kind of, kind of makes sense after a little bit of time. So, in terms of that, what I'll definitely tell you, it gets a thumbs up for me in the camera department for sure. Now, on top of that, another thing I'll say is that the software and the longevity portion of this, phone, even though it's kind of done getting software updates, I want to say that the Samsung a few years ago when the Note 20s came out, they kind of supported the Galaxy S10 with another year of software updates, and I think they added another year of security updates on top of it too. So during this phone's lifetime, it actually ended up lasting longer than when you initially bought it. So it was almost like you were getting an extra year of support or extra year of using this phone, which was awesome. So that was something that was really cool about this device, and I was really happy when Samsung ended up bringing that over to this phone. And since then, maybe this phone's not getting software updates anymore, but I will still say Android 12 is still supported. It's still kind of around for the most part, and I'm sure this phone's still going to be getting security updates. So it just depends on how long you plan on using this phone. If you plan on using it for like 5 years, this is probably not the phone to get. But if you plan on using it for a year or two, then I don't think there's any problem of using a phone like this, for that specific standpoint. So in terms of that, I'll definitely say thumbs up for me, but definitely it's going to be unsupported very soon, so just keep that in the back of your head. Now, in terms of the performance of this phone, this device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset inside with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model, 8 gigs of RAM on the mid-tier model, and it did go up to 12 gigabytes of RAM. Now, I remember back in 2019 when I got this phone felt like the fastest phone of all time. Like, I couldn't even think of a phone that was faster than this thing. And it's funny because definitely over time, random things have happened. We've gotten 120 hertz basically on all the phones now, which is awesome. But also, the chipsets have gotten so much better now that when I look back just a few years ago to this phone, which used to feel like the fastest phone of all time, and I compare it to some phones now that are definitely the fastest phones of all time, it just is so crazy to me that you would never expect a phone like this to feel old or seem slow when it first came out. We'll feel the same way of the S23s when, they're 3 years old, but I still say the performance of this phone is pretty good for its age. It's definitely not feeling like the slowest phone of all time. The only things I kind of, see on this phone are like random glitches. Whenever I open apps, that can take a little bit of extra time. Random things like that, but it's not anything where, it surprised me. Like, I kind of know what I'm getting when I get this phone, and because of the lack of 60 hertz as well, things don't seem as smooth as they used to with, newer phones, but it's totally understandable, and it's really not that big of a deal to me. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of the actual, battery life of this phone as well, very good battery life from this, device in my opinion. You had a 4100 mAh battery on this phone, very big. You had a wireless and reverse wireless charging as well, which is really cool. So overall, this phone in that standpoint definitely was very decent in my opinion. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll definitely tell you is, I would definitely say that the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus was a very powerful phone when it first came out, and maybe it's not necessarily the first phone I'd recommend buying right now, but if you currently have it, I would recommend keeping it for maybe another year or two. If you want to buy it, of course, get it, but if you plan on using it every single day, just know that it's unsupported with software right now, which means it's not going to be getting any major software updates. It may get small ones here and there, but it's not going to be getting One UI 5 or One UI 6 whenever that comes out. So otherwise, I think this is still a very powerful phone for its age, and the fact that it's so cheap now probably will make it a decent backup phone to kind of just have laying around. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.